Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. As a huge Resident Evil fan, my love affair with this franchise started with Resident Evil 2, and it really picked up to its crescendo with the remake of the original Resident Evil on the GameCube. However, in between these games, there was one that really cemented what a fan I would be. Welcome to my retro review of Resident Evil Code Veronica X. Released initially in 2000 on the Sega Dreamcast, Code Veronica would be the first Resident Evil game to be released on any console other than a PlayStation. However, Resident Evil Code Veronica X would be released in 2001 on the PlayStation 2 and was an updated version of the game that included a number of additional cutscenes that just helped to flesh out the story. The game was the fourth in the mainline series of the Resident Evil games, and at the time the only one not to actually follow a sequenced number. The game takes place 3 months after the events in Raccoon City seen in Resident Evil 2 and 3, and for the most part focuses on Resident Evil 2's Claire Redfield, although later on in the game we do also play as her brother, Chris Redfield, being the first time we would see the two siblings in the game together. The majority of the first half of the game takes place in a prison facility in the Southern Ocean that Claire has been taken to following being captured. The island facility is, of course, ravaged by a zombie outbreak, and the latter half of the game takes place in a facility out in Antarctica. This is, for the most part, where we see Chris Redfield come into the game. Understandably, due to the leap up in specs, the game has dramatically improved graphics, especially in the particularly impressive cutscenes. However, the game still plays similar to most other Resident Evil games that we'd seen in the past. However, there is one particular difference in the dynamic camera angle seen in this game. Whilst in the previous 3 Resident Evil games, the majority of shots would take place on effectively an interactive painting that your character walked around, with a few scenes allowing the camera to move to either the left or right. Resident Evil Code Veronica, and of course Code Veronica X, would actually see the camera move around you and the environment, creating a much more immersive situation. Some people found this far more intuitive, but not intuitive enough, and some found that it moved away a little bit too much from what they liked about the design and stylistic choice of Resident Evil games. However, it's fair to say it was a step towards what the Resident Evil games would become in the future, especially holding in mind games like Resident Evil 4 and 5. Out of the mainline Resident Evil games, everyone will have their preferred characters. However, I think it's fair to say that Chris Redfield and Claire Redfield are, in general, 2 of the most popular. So, as a game, this did set you up well, and Claire Redfield was particularly fun to play as. Whilst it did step away from that Raccoon City environment that had become so popular for the last 2 Resident Evil games, 3 if you include the mansion in the first one, it was still very much stylistically feeling like a Resident Evil game. The prison facility in particular was really fun to play in and quite creepy as well. The layout of it left you feeling more isolated than we ever had before. Whilst the new character Steve, seen mostly alongside Claire Redfield, was probably not anyone's favourite Resident Evil character, the twin siblings Alfred and Alexa Ashford were a dark contrast to Chris and Claire Redfield, 2 siblings with a very, very different presentation. Of course, we also get the return of Albert Wesker, one of my all-time favourite Resident Evil characters in this game, and he just rounds this roster up perfectly. But, that being said, how was this game received when it was released in 2001 on the PlayStation 2? And it is specifically that version of the game I'm looking at. Across the board, this was one of the most well-received Resident Evil games, or games of all time. Multiple 5 or 4.5 star reviews, 9 out of 10s and 90%, an A-. The lowest score I saw this get was an 8 out of 10, and even that was a massive outlier, whilst not exactly a bad score. Whilst I'm not directly focused on the Dreamcast version of the game, even that version was widely considered to be a must-own for the Dreamcast, and one of the best Dreamcast games ever made. Hard to disagree. The game's immersive story and atmosphere received major praise, with critics from Edge comparing it to a major Hollywood motion picture, which I have to agree. On this note, the cinematics and cutscenes in particular received a lot of praise. For the graphics at the time, this was about as good as you could possibly imagine getting, and they still hold up very well now, especially some of the proper cinematic cutscenes seen at the start of the game and at sporadic points through it. Code Veronica X, however, did receive a number of minor criticisms. Some commented that the fact that this was, apart from a few cutscenes, an almost direct port of an 18-month-old Dreamcast game. I don't really think that carries too much weight though. I mean, were they expecting them to completely redesign and rebuild a game from only 18 months ago? Quite frankly, it annoys me enough when people are so insistent on updating games now, from 10 years ago, instead of just enjoying what they have. Another criticism, and it is a minor one, was that despite the updated dynamic camera angles, the game still played out, well, like a Resident Evil game. And let's be honest, these Resident Evil games back when they were first released, going straight up to this game and a couple of others beyond, such as the remake of Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 0, all had a very specific control setup. It took a little bit of time to get used to, and it just wasn't for everybody. However, this was a Resident Evil game. They couldn't change too much without upsetting a lot of the core audience, and so, as fair as a criticism as it is, I don't think it's really that much of an issue. The fact that the game was nominated for an award for Action Adventure Game of the Year, narrowly beaten by GTA 3, shows that it wasn't that much of an issue for most people either. The PlayStation 2 version of the game would go on to sell 1.4 million copies. Combining that with the Dreamcast version of the game, it made 2.54 million copies sold worldwide, and that's before the game was re-released on the Nintendo GameCube. A massive financial success. But how does the game hold up now? How does the game hold up to modern scrutiny? Okay, deep breath and release. This is the part of the review I have been waiting for, because this is the part where I don't have to worry about what other people have said and thought. This is just me. I played this game on the PlayStation 2, and alongside GTA Vice City, it made up for a good 90% of my gaming time on the PlayStation 2. While Resident Evil 2 was the first game that introduced me to the franchise, and I really did love that game, this was the game that solidified my love for it. I found this game so much more playable. I found the graphics so much more interactive and attractive. It still kept that gothic, creepy layout that we'd seen in Resident Evil 2, but it just felt so much more alive. It felt much more like a video game, but also a Hollywood blockbuster horror movie. It had an adult narrative. It played on a host of horror tropes, but did it in a creative and original way. Claire Redfield was certainly one of my preferred characters in all of the Resident Evil games, and being able to play as her for the majority of the game really helped me enjoy the story. In all Resident Evil games, of course, the music is one of the most important parts in really setting the scene, and this game does it exceptionally well, as did the previous games, but in this one, it really felt just that bit more perfect each scene. It was then a long time before I replayed the game, and as followers of my channel will well know, I did actually try a playthrough on it a little while ago, before issues made me lose my save. It's a dark time, ignore that. But the point was, going back to play this game again, I still loved it. I fell right back into it. There was no issues gathering the controls. They felt a lot more comfortable than a lot of the other Resident Evil games ever did. I am not going to claim that the graphics on this are perfect by modern standards, however, I don't see them as a problem. The graphics in this game are still really good and have a specific look about them that really does give a clever nod to how the Dreamcast looked. Whilst it was played on the PlayStation 2 and in many ways garnered much of its popularity and especially sales there, the Dreamcast version and influence can be felt, and it's probably one of the few games that I have ever played that really can say that. In order to be fair and balanced, I do have two minor criticisms of the game. For me personally, whilst it would make the game a lot shorter, I personally feel that the big escape from the island in the plane actually feels like a perfect ending. The fact that we then land in Antarctica, a completely different environment, to begin a second phase to the story, I kind of lose interest a little bit at that point. But I will say, once we get back into it, it does pick up, the story does continue, and we're of course joined by Chris, which is really cool. And unfortunately, like the first Resident Evil game, some of the dialogue is a little bit hokey, especially the dialogue coming from Steve, that aforementioned not so popular character. When he is first introduced to Claire, he clearly has a crush on her, but it just comes across as creepy. When he's introduced to someone being her brother, his line of, your siblings, it's just not how anyone speaks. But it's a minor issue in an otherwise fantastic game. Resident Evil Code Veronica X is not just one of the best Resident Evil games, which, in my opinion and the opinion of many others, it clearly is, but it is also the evolution of the Resident Evil games. It was the first steps towards what we would see in the games going forward in Resident Evil 4, 5 and beyond. It was a brave and bold version of the game, and for me, it certainly deserves a score of 9 out of 10. Even now, looking back, it is still that good to play. Does it need a remake? That's a matter of opinion. However, if they do remake the game, it would be a shame if they changed it too much, because this right here is gaming perfection. But what are your thoughts on the game? Have you played it, and what console did you play it on? Comment below and let me know. And until next time, take the high ground.